Sarah Martinez stood in the dim light of her childhood bedroom, holding the cold medal of her father's Distinguished Service Cross between trembling fingers. The medal felt heavier than its actual weight, carrying decades of pride, loss, and unanswered questions. Captain Roberto Martinez had died in Afghanistan when Sarah was just 12 years old, leaving behind only this medal, faded photographs, and stories that never quite filled the void he left behind. The house creaked around her as evening settled over the small Texas town where she had grown up. At 28, Sarah had returned home after her mother's funeral, tasked with sorting through a lifetime of memories packed into cardboard boxes and dusty corners. Her mother, Elena, had kept everything exactly as it was the day they received the news of Roberto's death. His uniform still hung in the closet, his coffee mug sat unwashed in the kitchen cabinet, and his old radio equipment remained untouched in the basement. Sarah had avoided this room for years, but now she had no choice. The house needed to be sold, and someone had to decide what to keep and what to let go. She traced the bronze star at the center of the medal with her thumb, remembering how her father used to let her hold it when she was small, how he would tell her stories of brave soldiers who protected others even when they were afraid. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Sarah moved slowly around the room, picking up fragments of her father's life. There were books about military history, photographs of him with his unit, and letters he had written but never sent. Each item told a piece of his story, but Sarah realized she knew very little about who her father really was beyond the hero her mother had painted him to be. In the corner of the room sat an old wooden desk where Roberto used to work on his radio equipment. He had been a communications officer, skilled in the technical aspects of military radio operations. Sarah remembered watching him tinker with various devices, his hands moving with practiced precision as he explained frequency ranges and signal patterns to her young mind. She had been fascinated by his ability to reach across vast distances with nothing but radio waves and electronic components. The desk drawers were filled with technical manuals, circuit diagrams, and notebooks filled with her father's neat handwriting. Sarah pulled out one of the notebooks and flipped through pages of radio frequencies, call signs, and operational procedures. Much of it was beyond her understanding, but she could see the careful attention to detail that had made Roberto exceptional at his job. There were also personal notes scattered throughout, observations about weather patterns, atmospheric conditions, and how they affected radio communications. As she continued searching through the desk, Sarah found a small leather journal tucked away in the back of the bottom drawer. Unlike the technical notebooks, this one contained more personal entries. Roberto had written about his hopes for Sarah's future, his concerns about being deployed overseas, and his deep love for his family. Reading his words, Sarah felt closer to her father than she had since his death, but also more aware of how much she had lost when he never came home. The journal entries revealed a man who was both confident in his abilities and humble about his role in something larger than himself. Roberto wrote about the responsibility he felt toward his fellow soldiers, how his work in communications could mean the difference between life and death for the men and women in his unit. He understood that clear, reliable communication was the lifeline that connected scattered forces across dangerous terrain, and he took that responsibility seriously. One entry, written just weeks before his final deployment, stood out to Sarah. Roberto had written about a recurring dream where he was trying to send an important message, but the radio would not work properly. He described the frustration of knowing that lives depended on his ability to establish contact, but being unable to make the connection. The dream had disturbed him enough to write about it multiple times, and Sarah wondered if it had been some kind of premonition. As evening approached, Sarah found herself drawn to the basement where Roberto's radio equipment was stored. Her mother had never touched anything down there, claiming it was too technical for her to understand and too painful to deal with. The basement felt like a shrine to Roberto's professional life, with various radio sets, antennas, and electronic components arranged on workbenches just as he had left them. The main radio was an older military model that Roberto had been authorized to keep after his service. It was a complex piece of equipment with multiple dials, switches, and indicators that Sarah did not understand. Beside it were several notebooks containing frequency lists, contact information for other radio operators, and detailed logs of communications Roberto had maintained even after retiring from active duty. He had continued to participate in military radio networks, providing backup communication support during emergencies and maintaining connections with former colleagues. Sarah sat down at the radio desk and opened one of the communication logs. She could see that Roberto had been active in several different radio networks, including emergency communications groups and veteran organizations. The log showed regular check-ins with other operators across the country, brief conversations about weather, equipment, and family updates. It was clear that radio communication had remained an important part of Roberto's life even after leaving the military. The entries in the logs painted a picture of a man who valued connection and service. Roberto had participated in emergency communication drills, provided radio support during natural disasters, and mentored younger operators who were interested in military communications. He had maintained his skills and equipment, always ready to serve when needed. Sarah realized that her father's commitment to service had extended far beyond his official military career. As she read through more of the logs, Sarah began to understand the community that existed among radio operators. These were people who shared a common interest in communication technology, but, more than that, they shared a commitment to being available when others needed help. Roberto had been part of a network of volunteers who stood ready to provide communication support during emergencies, natural disasters, and other situations where normal communication systems might fail. The logs also revealed Roberto's personality in ways that Sarah had never seen before. His radio conversations were professional but warm, showing genuine interest in the lives and concerns of his fellow operators. He remembered details about their families, asked about their health, and offered help when needed. Through these brief exchanges, Roberto had maintained meaningful relationships with people across the country, creating an extended family of sorts through the airwaves. One name appeared frequently in the logs: Tom Wilson, call sign Whiskey 7 Alpha. Tom and Roberto had served together and continued their friendship through regular radio contact. Their conversations were longer than most, often including discussions about military history, current events, and family matters. Sarah could tell that Tom had been one of Roberto's closest friends, someone he trusted and respected deeply. The most recent entries in the logs were from the weeks before Roberto's final deployment. The tone of these entries was different, more serious and focused. Roberto had been coordinating with various operators about maintaining communication schedules while he was overseas, ensuring that his regular networks would continue to function in his absence. He had also been testing equipment and verifying frequencies, preparing for the communication challenges he would face in Afghanistan. Sarah found herself moved by the dedication her father had shown to his responsibilities. Even knowing that he was heading into danger, Roberto had been more concerned about ensuring that others could continue their important work than about his own safety. He had spent his final weeks at home making sure that every detail was taken care of, that every connection was secure, and that his absence would not create gaps in the communication networks he helped maintain. As she closed the communication logs, Sarah noticed something else on the desk: a small card with emergency contact information and procedures. It was labeled Silent Watch Protocol and contained detailed instructions for notifying the radio community when an operator became unavailable due to death or serious illness. The card explained that when an operator's call sign went silent, other members of the network would monitor their frequency and eventually transmit a final tribute acknowledging their service. The Silent Watch Protocol was a way for the radio community to honor their fallen members, ensuring that no operator simply disappeared without recognition. Sarah realized that this was probably what had happened when her father died, that somewhere in the country, other radio operators had listened for Roberto's call sign and eventually broadcast a memorial message when it became clear he would not be returning to the airwaves. Reading about the Silent Watch Protocol gave Sarah a new understanding of the bonds that existed among radio operators. These people, many of whom had never met in person, were connected by their shared commitment to communication and service. When one of them was lost, the entire community felt the impact, and they had developed meaningful ways to acknowledge that loss and honor the memory of their fallen colleagues. The basement grew quiet around Sarah as she absorbed this new understanding of her father's life. Roberto had not just been a soldier and a father, he had been part of a larger community of people dedicated to keeping communication lines open when others needed them most. His death had affected not just his immediate family, but a network of people across the country who had depended on his skill, reliability, and friendship. Sarah stood up from the desk and walked around the basement, looking at the various pieces of equipment with new eyes. Each device represented not just Roberto's technical expertise, but his commitment to being available when others needed help. The antennas, amplifiers, and backup power supplies were tools of service, ways for Roberto to extend his reach and effectiveness when normal communication systems failed. As she prepared to leave the basement, Sarah's attention was drawn to the main radio again. Despite being unused for years, it looked like it was still in good condition. Roberto had maintained his equipment carefully, and Sarah wondered if it might still be functional. She had no idea how to operate it, but the thought of hearing voices through her father's radio was strangely appealing. The metal was still in her hand as she climbed the stairs back to the main floor of the house. The weight of it seemed different now, not just a symbol of Roberto's military service, but a representation of his lifelong commitment to connection and communication. Sarah understood that her father's legacy was not just about the bravery he had shown in combat, but about the quiet dedication he had maintained to serving others throughout his life. Standing in the kitchen where Roberto used to drink his morning coffee, Sarah looked out the window at the neighborhood where she had grown up. The street lights were beginning to come on, and she could see families gathering in their homes for evening meals and activities. It struck her that Roberto's work in communications had been about connecting people, bridging distances, and ensuring that important messages could travel from one place to another when they were needed most. The house felt different to Sarah now, not just a repository of painful memories, but a place where someone important had prepared for a life of service. Roberto's room, his desk, and his radio equipment were not just reminders of loss, but evidence of a life lived with purpose and dedication. Sarah realized that she had inherited not just her father's mettle, but his example of commitment to something larger than himself. As night fell over the small Texas town, Sarah made a decision that surprised her. Instead of packing up Roberto's radio equipment to sell or donate, she would learn how to use it. She would find a way to honor her father's memory by continuing his participation in the communication networks he had valued so deeply. The medal in her hand would remain a symbol of Roberto's military service, but Sarah would create her own way of carrying forward his legacy of connection and service to others. 3 weeks after discovering her father's radio equipment, Sarah found herself sitting in a community college classroom, surrounded by people eager to learn amateur radio operation. The instructor, a retired engineer named Bill Henderson, had been operating radios for over 40 years and had agreed to help Sarah understand the basics of her father's hobby. She clutched Roberto's technical manuals under her arm, hoping that his detailed notes would help her make sense of the complex world of radio communication. The class was smaller than Sarah had expected, with only 8 students ranging in age from teenagers to retirees. Each person had their own reason for wanting to learn radio operation: emergency preparedness, scientific interest, or simply the desire to connect with people around the world. Sarah explained that she wanted to understand and possibly continue her father's involvement in radio networks, which earned her encouraging nods from the other students and the instructor. Bill Henderson proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and thorough in his explanations of radio theory, antenna design, and communication procedures. He started with basic concepts like frequency and wavelength, gradually building up to more complex topics like propagation, modulation, and network protocols. Sarah was surprised to discover that she had an aptitude for understanding the technical aspects of radio operation, perhaps inherited from Roberto's engineering mindset. The first practical lesson involved learning to tune a simple radio receiver and identify different types of signals. Sarah was amazed by the variety of communications she could hear: amateur radio operators exchanging technical information, emergency coordinators conducting drills, and international broadcasters reaching across oceans. Each signal represented people connecting across vast distances, sharing information, and maintaining relationships through the medium of radio waves. As the weeks progressed, Sarah learned about the different frequency bands allocated for amateur radio use and the characteristics that made each band suitable for different types of communication. Lower frequencies could travel long distances by bouncing off the ionosphere, while higher frequencies provided clear local communication but had limited range. Understanding these principles helped Sarah appreciate the skill and knowledge that Roberto had developed over his years of radio operation. The licensing exam preparation was challenging, requiring Sarah to learn regulations, technical specifications, and operating procedures. She studied Roberto's notes intensively, finding that his explanations were often clearer and more practical than the official study materials. His years of experience had taught him to focus on the most important concepts and to understand the real-world applications of theoretical principles. During one study session, Sarah discovered a folder in Roberto's desk that contained copies of messages he had handled during emergency communications exercises. These were realistic scenarios where amateur radio operators provided backup communication for emergency services when normal systems were overwhelmed or damaged. Sarah read through transcripts of messages coordinating rescue operations, medical evacuations, and disaster relief efforts, gaining new appreciation for the critical role that radio operators could play during emergencies. The emergency communication exercises revealed another side of Roberto's character that Sarah had not fully understood before. While she knew he had been dedicated to military service, she now saw that his commitment extended to civilian emergency preparedness as well. Roberto had volunteered countless hours training for situations where radio operators might be the only reliable means of communication available to emergency responders and relief organizations. One particular exercise stood out in Roberto's files, a simulated hurricane scenario where amateur radio operators provided communication support for evacuation operations along the Gulf Coast. Roberto had been assigned to coordinate between multiple shelters and emergency management centers, relaying information about available space, medical needs, and transportation requirements. The messages showed his ability to remain calm under pressure and to handle multiple communication channels simultaneously. Sarah began to understand that her father's radio work was not just a hobby, but a form of public service that complemented his military career. Amateur radio operators like Roberto formed an informal but organized network of volunteers who stood ready to provide communication support whenever and wherever it was needed. They maintained their equipment, practiced their skills, and trained regularly so they could respond effectively during real emergencies. The technical aspects of radio operation proved more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. Understanding concepts like standing wave ratio, impedance matching, and antenna radiation patterns required careful study and practical experience. Roberto's notebooks contained detailed explanations of these concepts, often illustrated with hand-drawn diagrams that made complex ideas easier to understand. Sarah could see that he had been not just a skilled operator, but also an effective teacher. Bill Henderson encouraged students to visit local radio clubs and emergency communication groups to observe experienced operators in action. Sarah decided to attend a meeting of the County Emergency Communication Association, the same group that Roberto had belonged to for many years. She was nervous about introducing herself, knowing that many of these people had worked with her father and might have strong memories of him. The meeting was held in the basement of the county courthouse, in a room filled with radio equipment, maps, and emergency planning materials. About 20 people attended, ranging from young adults to senior citizens, but all sharing a common interest in emergency preparedness and radio communication. When Sarah introduced herself as Roberto Martinez's daughter, the response was immediate and heartfelt. Tom Wilson, the operator whose call sign had appeared frequently in Roberto's communication logs, was the first to approach Sarah after the meeting. He was a tall, quiet man with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and Sarah could immediately understand why her father had valued his friendship. Tom had been Roberto's communication partner during many emergency exercises, and he had many stories about Roberto's skill, dedication, and good humor during long hours of radio operation. Through Tom and other members of the group, Sarah learned more about Roberto's reputation within the amateur radio community. He had been known for his technical expertise, his ability to maintain communication under difficult conditions, and his willingness to help less experienced operators improve their skills. Several people mentioned that Roberto had been their mentor when they were learning radio operation, and that his patient teaching had helped them become successful operators themselves. The emergency communication group met monthly to plan training exercises, maintain equipment, and coordinate with local emergency management agencies. Sarah was impressed by the level of organization and preparation that went into their activities. These volunteers took their responsibilities seriously, understanding that their skills might be needed during the most challenging circumstances their community could face. During one training exercise, Sarah was allowed to observe as the group conducted a simulated communication drill. The scenario involved a severe storm that had damaged normal communication infrastructure, requiring amateur radio operators to provide backup communication for emergency services. Sarah watched as operators established communication networks, relayed messages between different agencies, and maintained detailed logs of all activities. The exercise revealed the complexity of emergency communication operations. Operators had to coordinate multiple frequencies, manage traffic between different types of users, and ensure that critical messages received priority handling. They also had to maintain accurate records of all communications, providing documentation that emergency managers could use for planning and coordination purposes. Sarah was struck by the calm professionalism displayed by the operators during the exercise. Even though it was only a drill, they treated it with the seriousness of a real emergency, understanding that their training needed to be as realistic as possible to prepare them for actual disasters. She could see why Roberto had been drawn to this type of work, combining technical skills with meaningful service to others. As her radio education continued, Sarah began to appreciate the international scope of amateur radio communication. On good propagation days, signals could travel thousands of miles, connecting operators across continents and cultures. Roberto's logs showed contacts with operators in dozens of countries, brief conversations that had created connections across political and geographical boundaries. The global nature of amateur radio was particularly evident during contests and special events, when operators around the world would attempt to make as many contacts as possible within specific time periods. Roberto had participated in several of these events, often staying up all night to take advantage of favorable propagation conditions. His contest log showed contacts with operators in remote locations, from research stations in Antarctica to expeditions on small Pacific islands. Sarah learned that amateur radio had played important roles during international disasters, providing emergency communication when normal systems were destroyed or overwhelmed. During earthquakes, hurricanes, and other major disasters, amateur radio operators had often been the first to establish communication with affected areas, relaying information about damage, casualties, and urgent needs to emergency management agencies and relief organizations. The humanitarian aspect of amateur radio particularly appealed to Sarah, who was beginning to see how her father's hobby had allowed him to continue serving others even after his military retirement. Amateur radio operators formed an informal but effective international network of volunteers, ready to provide communication support whenever and wherever it was needed, without regard for political boundaries or national interests. As Sarah prepared for her licensing exam, she spent many evenings in Roberto's basement radio station, studying his equipment and trying to understand how it all worked together. The main radio was indeed still functional, and, with Tom's help, Sarah was able to receive signals and listen to amateur radio communications from around the world. Hearing voices through her father's radio gave her a tangible connection to the community he had been part of. The antenna system that Roberto had installed was more sophisticated than Sarah had initially realized. He had multiple antennas for different frequency bands, along with switching systems that allowed him to select the best antenna for each type of communication. The installation was neat and professional, reflecting Roberto's attention to detail and his understanding of the technical requirements for effective radio operation. Roberto's technical library was extensive, containing books on antenna design, propagation theory, and communication protocols. Many of the books were filled with his handwritten notes and observations, showing how he had continued learning and improving his skills throughout his radio career. Sarah was beginning to understand that amateur radio was not just about operating equipment, but about continual learning and experimentation. The computer logs that Roberto had maintained showed the breadth of his radio activities. In addition to emergency communication work, he had participated in technical experiments, satellite communication tests, and digital communication development projects. He had been particularly interested in weak signal communication techniques, methods that allowed operators to maintain contact even under challenging propagation conditions. Sarah discovered that Roberto had been working on a technical paper about emergency communication procedures just before his final deployment. The unfinished manuscript discussed lessons learned from recent disaster response operations and recommendations for improving coordination between amateur radio operators and professional emergency services. It was clear that Roberto had been thinking deeply about how to make emergency communication more effective and reliable. Reading through Roberto's technical writings, Sarah gained insight into his analytical mind and his commitment to improving amateur radio practices. He was not content to simply operate his equipment, he wanted to understand how to make the entire system work better for everyone. His recommendations were practical and well-reasoned, based on years of experience and careful observation of what worked and what didn't during actual emergency operations. As her examination date approached, Sarah felt increasingly confident about her technical knowledge but nervous about joining the amateur radio community. These were people who had known and respected her father, and she wondered if she could live up to their expectations. Tom Wilson reassured her that the amateur radio community was welcoming to new operators, especially those who showed genuine interest in learning and serving others. The night before her exam, Sarah sat in Roberto's radio station and reflected on everything she had learned over the past few months. Amateur radio was much more than a hobby, it was a way of life that combined technical knowledge, public service, and international friendship. Roberto had found in amateur radio a way to continue his commitment to communication and service, connecting with people around the world and standing ready to help whenever needed. Sarah realized that her decision to learn amateur radio was not just about honoring her father's memory, but about discovering a new way to connect with others and contribute to her community. The medal that had started her on this journey still represented Roberto's military service, but now it also symbolized the broader commitment to service that had characterized his entire life. As she turned off the lights in the radio station and headed upstairs, Sarah felt ready to take her licensing exam and begin her own journey as an amateur radio operator. She knew that Roberto would have been proud to see her following in his footsteps, carrying forward his commitment to communication, service, and connection with others around the world. Sarah passed her amateur radio licensing exam on the first attempt, earning the call sign November 5 Delta Mike Yankee, which she would use for all her radio communications. The volunteer examiners, including Tom Wilson, congratulated her warmly and presented her with her license certificate. She was now officially authorized to operate on amateur radio frequencies, but she knew that getting the license was just the beginning of her real education as a radio operator. The first few weeks after getting her license were spent learning to operate Roberto's radio equipment under Tom's patient guidance. The controls that had seemed mysterious and intimidating now began to make sense as Sarah learned to adjust frequency, power output, and antenna selection. Tom showed her how to tune the antenna system for maximum efficiency and how to interpret the various meters and indicators that displayed the radio's operating status. Her first on-air contact was with a local amateur radio operator who was conducting a practice session for new licensees. Sarah's voice shook with nervousness as she gave her call sign and basic information, but the other operator was encouraging and friendly. The conversation was brief but meaningful, marking Sarah's official entry into the amateur radio community that had been so important to her father. Word spread quickly through the local amateur radio community that Roberto Martinez's daughter had earned her license and was operating from his station. Sarah began receiving visits from operators who had known Roberto, each bringing their own memories and stories about her father's contributions to amateur radio. These visits helped Sarah understand the respect that Roberto had earned through years of dedicated service and technical expertise. One visitor was particularly memorable, an elderly woman named Margaret Chen who had worked with Roberto during several emergency communication exercises. Margaret explained that Roberto had been instrumental in developing improved procedures for handling health and welfare messages during disasters, communications that helped families reconnect when normal telephone and internet services were disrupted. His work had directly helped hundreds of people during various emergency situations. Margaret shared a story about a hurricane response operation where Roberto had worked for 36 straight hours, coordinating communications between evacuation shelters and family members searching for missing relatives. Despite his exhaustion, Roberto had maintained his professionalism and accuracy, ensuring that every message was handled properly and that families received the information they desperately needed. Margaret said that Roberto's dedication during that operation had become legendary within the emergency communication community. Through these conversations, Sarah learned that Roberto had been working on several technical projects at the time of his final deployment. He had been experimenting with digital communication modes that could provide more reliable message handling during emergencies, and he had been developing training materials for new emergency communication volunteers. His unfinished projects represented significant contributions to amateur radio emergency communication capabilities. Tom Wilson offered to help Sarah continue some of Roberto's projects, particularly the development of improved emergency communication procedures. Sarah was initially hesitant, feeling unqualified to work on technical projects that were beyond her current knowledge level, but Tom assured her that she could learn the necessary skills while contributing meaningful work to the amateur radio community. The first project involved updating Roberto's emergency communication manual, which contained detailed procedures for amateur radio operators participating in disaster response operations. The manual needed to incorporate lessons learned from recent disasters and new technologies that had become available since Roberto had last updated it. Sarah found herself studying emergency communication reports and interviewing experienced operators to gather the information needed for the updates. Working on the emergency communication manual gave Sarah deeper insight into the complexity of disaster response operations and the critical role that amateur radio operators played in supporting professional emergency services. She learned about communication protocols, message prioritization procedures, and coordination techniques that ensured effective information flow during chaotic emergency situations. The manual revision project also connected Sarah with amateur radio emergency coordinators from other states who had worked with Roberto on various regional and national emergency communication initiatives. Through these contacts, Sarah learned that her father's reputation extended far beyond their local community, that he was known and respected by emergency communication leaders across the entire country. One particularly impressive contact was Linda Rodriguez, the emergency communication coordinator for a large metropolitan area that had experienced several major disasters in recent years. Linda explained that Roberto had helped develop communication procedures that were now used as standard practice in emergency operations throughout their region. His contributions had improved the effectiveness of amateur radio support during disasters, potentially saving lives and reducing suffering. Linda invited Sarah to participate in a regional emergency communication exercise that would test coordination between amateur radio operators and professional emergency services across multiple states. The exercise would provide valuable experience in large-scale emergency communication operations, and Linda thought that Sarah's participation would be a fitting way to honor Roberto's contributions to emergency communication development. Sarah accepted the invitation, despite feeling nervous about participating in such a complex operation with her limited experience. Tom Wilson agreed to mentor her through the preparation process, and several other local operators offered to provide additional support during the exercise. Sarah realized that the amateur radio community was committed to helping her succeed, not just because of who her father was, but because they valued her genuine interest in contributing to their mission. Preparation for the regional exercise required Sarah to learn advanced communication procedures, including techniques for handling multiple frequencies simultaneously and coordinating between different types of emergency services. She spent hours studying Roberto's notes on emergency communication management and practicing with simulation software that recreated the communication challenges of large-scale disaster operations. The exercise scenario involved a major earthquake affecting multiple states, requiring amateur radio operators to provide backup communication for emergency services whose normal systems had been damaged or overloaded. Sarah's assignment was to assist with health and welfare message handling, the same type of work that Roberto had specialized in during his emergency communication career. The day of the exercise arrived with Sarah feeling prepared but nervous about her first major amateur radio operation. The local emergency operations center had been set up with multiple radio stations, each handling different aspects of the simulated emergency communication requirements. Sarah took her position at a station dedicated to health and welfare messages, surrounded by more experienced operators who provided guidance and support. The exercise began at dawn with simulated reports of earthquake damage and requests for communication support from affected areas. Sarah found herself handling messages from simulated evacuation shelters, coordinating with other amateur radio operators to relay information about missing persons and family reunification efforts. The pace was intense, requiring constant attention to detail and careful coordination with other operators. During the first few hours of the exercise, Sarah struggled with the complexity of managing multiple communication channels while maintaining accurate records of all message traffic. Tom Wilson, operating at an adjacent station, provided helpful guidance when Sarah encountered difficult situations, but she gradually gained confidence in her ability to handle the demanding requirements of emergency communication work. As the exercise progressed, Sarah began to understand the rhythm of emergency communication operations. Messages arrived in unpredictable bursts, requiring operators to quickly prioritize urgent traffic while ensuring that all messages received proper handling. The work demanded both technical skill and emotional resilience, as many of the simulated messages involved families desperate for information about missing loved ones. The most challenging part of the exercise came during the afternoon when simulated communication equipment failures required operators to rapidly reconfigure their stations and establish alternative communication paths. Sarah watched as experienced operators smoothly adapted to changing conditions, maintaining communication coverage despite equipment problems and changing propagation conditions. During one particularly intense period, Sarah found herself handling communication between a simulated field hospital and emergency management headquarters, relaying critical information about medical supplies and patient evacuation requirements. The experience gave her a visceral understanding of how amateur radio operators could directly contribute to saving lives during actual emergency situations. The exercise concluded after 12 hours with a debriefing session where participants discussed lessons learned and areas for improvement. Sarah received positive feedback from exercise controllers, who noted her professionalism and ability to adapt to challenging situations. Several experienced operators commented that she had demonstrated natural aptitude for emergency communication work, similar to the skills that had made her father such an effective operator. Linda Rodriguez approached Sarah after the debriefing to discuss her performance during the exercise. Linda was impressed by Sarah's ability to handle complex communication tasks while maintaining the calm professionalism required for emergency operations. She invited Sarah to consider joining the regional emergency communication team as a regular volunteer, following in Roberto's footsteps as a specialist in health and welfare message handling. The invitation to join the regional emergency communication team represented a significant commitment, requiring additional training and regular participation in exercises and actual emergency operations. Sarah was honored by the invitation but needed time to consider whether she was ready for such responsibility. Tom Wilson encouraged her to accept, pointing out that she had already demonstrated the skills and dedication necessary for effective emergency communication work. That evening, Sarah returned to Roberto's radio station feeling exhausted but exhilarated by her first major amateur radio operation. She had successfully completed challenging communication tasks under simulated emergency conditions, proving to herself and others that she could contribute meaningfully to the amateur radio emergency communication mission. As she sat at Roberto's radio desk, Sarah reflected on the day's experiences and the opportunities that lay ahead. The emergency communication exercise had shown her that amateur radio was much more than a technical hobby. It was a way to serve others during their most vulnerable moments, providing critical communication support when normal systems failed. The medal that had started Sarah on this journey still sat prominently on Roberto's desk, but now it was surrounded by her own amateur radio materials, her license certificate, exercise documentation, and technical manuals that she was studying to improve her emergency communication skills. The medal remained a symbol of Roberto's military service, but Sarah was creating her own legacy of service through amateur radio. Sarah realized that she had found her calling in amateur radio emergency communication, a way to honor her father's memory while contributing her own skills and dedication to serving others. The technical challenges were stimulating, the service mission was meaningful, and the amateur radio community had welcomed her with warmth and respect. The regional emergency communication team represented an opportunity to carry forward Roberto's work while developing her own expertise and reputation within the amateur radio community. Sarah understood that accepting the invitation would require significant commitment and continued learning, but she felt ready to take on that challenge. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah made her decision. She would accept Linda Rodriguez's invitation to join the regional emergency communication team, beginning her own career as a specialist in amateur radio emergency services. The next morning, she would call Linda to accept the position and begin the additional training required for regional emergency communication operations. Roberto's radio station would once again be active in emergency communication service, but now under Sarah's call sign and with her own developing expertise and dedication. The equipment that Roberto had carefully maintained would continue to serve the amateur radio emergency communication mission, connecting people during disasters and helping families reunite when normal communication systems failed. Sarah understood that she was not trying to replace her father or duplicate his achievements, but rather to continue his mission of service in her own way. She had her own skills, perspectives, and contributions to make to the amateur radio community, while carrying forward the values of service and dedication that Roberto had embodied throughout his life. The transition from holding her father's medal to actively participating in amateur radio emergency communication represented Sarah's evolution from grieving daughter to committed public servant. She had found a way to transform her loss into meaningful service, creating her own legacy while honoring the memory of the father she had loved and admired. 6 months after joining the regional emergency communication team, Sarah had established herself as a reliable and skilled operator specializing in health and welfare traffic. She had participated in responses to 2 actual disasters, a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma and flooding in Louisiana, where her calm professionalism and attention to detail had earned praise from emergency management officials and fellow amateur radio operators alike. On a quiet Tuesday evening in November, Sarah was monitoring emergency frequencies from Roberto's radio station when she heard an unusual transmission on the regional emergency coordination frequency. The voice was unfamiliar, speaking with the measured cadence of someone delivering an important official message. Sarah turned up the volume and listened carefully as the transmission continued. The operator identified himself as the emergency communication coordinator for a military installation she recognized from Roberto's old contact lists. He was broadcasting a request for information about veteran amateur radio operators who had served in Afghanistan between 2010 and 2012. The request was related to an ongoing investigation into a communication incident that had occurred during Roberto's final deployment. Sarah's heart began racing as she realized that the investigation might be connected to her father's death. She had always been told that Roberto died in a vehicle accident while traveling between bases, but the details had always been vague, and her mother had discouraged questions about the specifics of what happened. The mention of a communication incident suggested that there might be more to the story than Sarah had been told. The coordinator explained that military investigators had recently discovered evidence that suggested a critical communication failure had contributed to the incident that killed several soldiers, including Roberto. New technology had allowed them to analyze communication records that had been corrupted or incomplete at the time of the original investigation. They were now seeking to contact amateur radio operators who had served in the region to help them understand what had actually happened. Sarah immediately contacted Tom Wilson to discuss what she had heard and to ask for his advice on how to respond to the military's request for information. Tom was familiar with Roberto's military service record and had heard stories about the circumstances of his death, but, like Sarah, he had been told only that Roberto had been killed in a vehicle accident while performing routine communication duties. Tom suggested that Sarah contact the military coordinator directly to identify herself as Roberto's daughter and to offer any assistance she could provide in their investigation. He warned her that the investigation might reveal painful details about Roberto's death, but he also pointed out that learning the truth might help her better understand her father's final service and sacrifice. The next morning, Sarah called the number provided by the military coordinator and spoke with Colonel James Mitchell, who was leading the investigation into the communication incident. Colonel Mitchell was surprised and pleased to hear from Roberto's daughter, explaining that they had been trying to contact Roberto's family for several weeks but had been unsuccessful in locating current contact information. Colonel Mitchell explained that the investigation had been prompted by the recent discovery of communication equipment recovered from the incident site. Analysis of this equipment had revealed that Roberto and his team had been involved in a complex communication operation when they were attacked, not the routine transport mission that had been described in the original incident reports. The new evidence suggested that Roberto's team had been providing critical communication support for a special operations mission when they came under enemy fire. The colonel requested permission to visit Sarah in person to discuss the investigation and to share information that had been classified at the time of Roberto's death but could now be disclosed to his family. Sarah agreed to meet with Colonel Mitchell, despite her apprehension about learning details that might change her understanding of how her father had died. Colonel Mitchell arrived at Sarah's home the following week, accompanied by a military historian and a technical specialist who had analyzed the communication equipment recovered from the incident site. They brought with them a detailed briefing about the operation that had led to Roberto's death and evidence that significantly altered the official account of what had happened. The officers explained that Roberto's team had been providing communication support for a joint military operation designed to rescue American civilians who had been taken hostage by insurgents. The rescue mission required sophisticated communication coordination between ground forces, air support, and command headquarters, exactly the type of complex operation where Roberto's skills were most valuable. According to the newly analyzed evidence, Roberto and his communication team had successfully established and maintained communication networks that enabled the rescue operation to proceed successfully. All of the hostages had been safely recovered, largely due to the reliable communication support that Roberto's team had provided under extremely dangerous conditions. However, as the rescue operation was concluding, Roberto's team had received orders to establish emergency communication with a second rescue force that had encountered unexpected resistance. Roberto had remained at his exposed communication position to maintain contact with the endangered rescue team, despite incoming enemy fire that was forcing other personnel to take cover. The technical analysis revealed that Roberto had continued transmitting critical coordination information even after his communication vehicle had been hit by enemy fire. His final transmissions had provided position updates and tactical information that enabled air support to locate and assist the embattled rescue team, preventing what could have been a catastrophic loss of American military personnel. Roberto's commitment to maintaining communication had ultimately cost him his life, but his actions had directly contributed to saving the lives of both rescued civilians and military personnel. The investigation concluded that Roberto's final communications had been the decisive factor in the success of both rescue operations, preventing what could have been a major military and humanitarian disaster. Colonel Mitchell presented Sarah with documentation of Roberto's final communications, including transcripts of his last transmissions and technical analysis of his communication equipment performance under combat conditions. The evidence painted a picture of extraordinary professionalism and dedication under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The colonel also informed Sarah that Roberto's actions during the incident had earned him additional military honors that had not been awarded at the time of his death due to the classified nature of the operation. The military was now prepared to present these honors to Roberto's family, recognizing his crucial contribution to the success of the rescue operations and his ultimate sacrifice in service to others. The new information about Roberto's death was both painful and inspiring for Sarah. Learning that her father had died while actively engaged in saving others' lives was consistent with everything she had learned about his character and values, but it also made his loss feel more profound and meaningful. That evening, Sarah sat in Roberto's radio station holding his Distinguished Service Cross while processing everything she had learned about his final service. The medal now carried additional significance, representing not just Roberto's military service in general, but his specific sacrifice while performing the communication work that he had dedicated his life to perfecting. As she reflected on the day's revelations, Sarah heard activity on one of the emergency communication frequencies she had been monitoring. Local emergency services were responding to a serious traffic accident on a major highway, and amateur radio operators were being requested to provide communication support for the response operation. Sarah immediately activated Roberto's radio equipment and contacted the emergency communication coordinator to offer her assistance. She was assigned to handle communication between the accident scene and local hospitals, relaying information about casualties and coordinating medical evacuation resources. The work was exactly the type of emergency communication that Roberto had specialized in during his amateur radio career. As Sarah managed the communication traffic for the accident response, she felt a deep connection to Roberto's legacy of service. She was using his equipment, operating from his station, and applying skills that he had helped develop to assist with an emergency situation that directly paralleled the type of work he had done throughout his life. The accident response lasted several hours, during which Sarah handled dozens of critical messages that helped coordinate medical care for multiple casualties. Her calm professionalism and attention to detail contributed to the efficient response that likely saved lives and minimized suffering for accident victims and their families. When the emergency response concluded, Sarah received thanks from emergency service commanders and fellow amateur radio operators who had participated in the communication support effort. Tom Wilson, who had also participated in the response, complimented Sarah on her professional performance during what had been a complex and demanding operation. As Sarah powered down Roberto's radio equipment after the emergency response, she realized that the day's events had created a profound connection between her father's military sacrifice and her own commitment to emergency communication service. Roberto had died while providing critical communication support that saved lives, and Sarah was now continuing that mission through her own emergency communication work. The radio suddenly crackled to life with an unexpected transmission on the frequency used for special amateur radio ceremonies. The voice was that of Linda Rodriguez, the regional emergency communication coordinator, speaking in the formal tone reserved for important announcements. Sarah turned up the volume and listened as Linda began to speak. "This is a silent watch notification for Captain Roberto Martinez, call sign November 5 Delta Mike X-ray," Linda announced. Captain Martinez served his country with distinction in Afghanistan and continued that service through amateur radio emergency communication until his death in the line of duty. Sarah realized that Linda was conducting a silent watch ceremony for Roberto, the amateur radio tradition for honoring operators who had died in service. The ceremony had probably been delayed until now because the classified nature of Roberto's final mission had prevented the amateur radio community from learning the true circumstances of his death. Linda continued the ceremony, describing Roberto's contributions to amateur radio emergency communication and his dedication to serving others through both military and civilian radio service. She invited other operators to share their memories of Roberto and his impact on the amateur radio community. One by one, amateur radio operators from across the region began transmitting tributes to Roberto. Sarah heard voices from operators she had met during emergency exercises, others she had only heard on the radio, and some who had worked with Roberto years before she had earned her amateur radio license. Each tribute added to the picture of a man who had dedicated his life to connecting people and serving others through radio communication. The most moving tribute came from an operator Sarah had never heard before, someone who identified himself as a former military colleague who had served with Roberto in Afghanistan. He described Roberto's technical expertise, his leadership under pressure, and his commitment to ensuring that communication systems worked reliably even under the most challenging conditions. The final tribute was from Tom Wilson, who spoke about Roberto's role as a mentor to new amateur radio operators and his contributions to emergency communication development. Tom concluded by noting that Roberto's dedication to service lived on through his daughter, who had earned her amateur radio license and was continuing his tradition of emergency communication service. Linda concluded the silent watch ceremony by announcing that Roberto's call sign, November 5 Delta Mike X-ray, was being retired from active use and would be added to the memorial list of amateur radio operators who had died in service to others. The frequency would observe 1 minute of silence in Roberto's honor, after which normal amateur radio operations would resume. As the minute of silence began, Sarah sat quietly at Roberto's radio station, surrounded by the equipment he had used to serve others and holding the medal that represented his military sacrifice. The silent watch ceremony had provided formal recognition of Roberto's contributions to both military and amateur radio service, acknowledging his life of dedication to communication and service. When the minute of silence ended, Sarah picked up the microphone and transmitted her own tribute to her father. Speaking as November 5 Delta Mike Yankee, Roberto's daughter and a member of the amateur radio emergency communication community, she thanked everyone who had participated in the silent watch ceremony and committed to continuing Roberto's tradition of service through her own emergency communication work. The amateur radio community responded warmly to Sarah's transmission, with multiple operators expressing their support for her continued participation in emergency communication service and their appreciation for her dedication to continuing Roberto's legacy. Sarah realized that she had been fully accepted as a member of the community that had been so important to her father. As the evening concluded, Sarah carefully placed Roberto's Distinguished Service Cross in its display case, but this time she positioned it next to her own amateur radio license and emergency communication certificates. The medal represented Roberto's military service and sacrifice, while Sarah's documents represented her own commitment to continuing his mission of service through amateur radio emergency communication. The day had brought Sarah full circle from her initial discovery of Roberto's medal to her understanding of his final sacrifice and her own role in continuing his legacy. She had learned that Roberto's death had been meaningful and heroic, that his life had been dedicated to serving others, and that she could honor his memory by continuing that tradition of service in her own way. Roberto's radio station would continue to serve the amateur radio emergency communication mission, but now under Sarah's call sign and with her own developing expertise and dedication. The equipment that Roberto had carefully maintained would continue to connect people during emergencies and help families reunite when normal communication systems failed, carrying forward the mission that had defined Roberto's life and inspired Sarah's own commitment to service. The journey that had begun with Sarah holding her father's medal in an empty bedroom had led her to active participation in the amateur radio emergency communication community, where she could honor Roberto's memory while contributing her own skills and dedication to serving others. The medal remained a symbol of Roberto's sacrifice, but Sarah had created her own legacy of service that would continue long into the future.